That's a great question. I think at least on the European side, where I have more background than on the US side, on the European side, the EU Chips Act was heavily informed by the European Commission's experience with the COVID vaccines. So if you remember back in 2021, Europe didn't get the amount of COVID vaccines that they ordered. There were some, let's say, mishaps. Companies didn't quite behave in terms of upholding their contractual obligations. And then the European Commission and member states took matters a little bit in their own hands and forced companies to comply through priority rated orders, through export authorizations. They also built up their own understanding of the supply chain. So who is building the needles, who is building the cooling chambers, and so on. And you could argue that it worked, at least to some extent, that the governments got more sophisticated in their understanding of the global vaccine supply chain,
right,
and who to blame for which problems. Now, I don't want to downplay the level of sophistication that goes into vaccine production, but I think it's fair to say that vaccines are a fundamentally different product and a fundamentally different supply chain in terms of characteristics than semiconductors, right? Like everybody needs the same vaccine, but with semiconductors, you talk about a highly customized, highly configured and diversified product. But the same idea, let's map the supply chain, let's put in place priority rated orders, export authorizations, common purchasing even. These are all ideas that you find in the EU Chips Act, were adopted to this other value chain, to semiconductors, with the idea that, well, if they worked in this supply chain, we can make it work in another supply chain. And we wrote extensively about this. There we think these are just flawed concepts, because just because a policy tool works in one supply chain, it doesn't automatically mean that it works in a different supply chain. I mean, if you say it like this, it sounds kind of obvious, but you still need to make the point. But so the COVID crisis and then all the supply chain disruptions around the COVID crisis heavily informed the European discussion. Again, I would say in the US, the focus was a little bit different, because I would say it was heavily informed by the increasing or intensifying technology competition with China, and the conviction by the US government already under Trump that maybe even before that there is a long-term technology competition with China, that China is a long-term adversary, and that in certain critical technologies, the US needs to lead no matter what. And you also have to acknowledge that no matter what you think about the US approach, they are really walking the walk in terms of administrative resources. So the Department of Commerce now hired around 150 people just for the implementation of the US Chips Act.
Interesting.
You don't see any of that, not even by the factor 10 less. You don't see any of that happening either in Berlin or in Brussels or other member states that I know of. So the idea that in the US, if you spend this amount of subsidies, if you want to enter a technology competition, you need government resources to think through those long-term challenges. This is understood in Brussels and Berlin as well, of course, but it is not yet translated into beefing up those government resources in a Ministry of Economics, in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on, to analyze value chains, to assess second-order effects, third-order effects of export controls, and so on and so forth. So very little investment so far, I would say, in Europe into the government's ability to assess those technology ecosystems and ultimately form a geopolitical position.